captain's house that people like to talk about. And the Pierce Haskell Hallett House was one of that type. Here we have the two houses on Pleasant Street that actually are very reminiscent of the other one. And what I'd like to do is refer you all to Prudence Fish's book, The Antique Houses of Gloucester, which is really very thorough on the details of each of these houses. And in the meantime, I'll continue on with the interior. Thank you, Zillow. Some of these houses get advertised on the web, and we have them to thank for this, and I hope I didn't need too much permission to use them, but this is educational purposes. We've got the interior of that house, and you can see the very fine details of the interior from that period of 1806 or so. And these buildings actually, I believe the one closest at least belongs to the Cape Ann Museum. So it shows you the potential of one of these, and also what the Pierce Haskell Hallett House looked like when it was done in the early 1800s. And it does have details that go back even further. If you notice, the door on the left is a Georgian type of door with the little panels in the middle rather than at the top. In the Federal period, they were 6-panel doors. They called them Christian doors with a cross at the top. Well, the Georgian period is slightly earlier. Those doors on the left there went out of fashion around the 1780s or so, 1790s. And then you get to the third story in that house, and you see a simple band molding around the fireplace opening and simple trim around the windows. But that's the story of the Pierce Haskell Hallett House and the way Caliph House and the way it evolved. You see on the left here, it's fortunate this takes that half of the house and turns it into basically a half house, which is what the Pierce Haskell Caliph House was, we believe. It had the doorway on the left, according to one account. And that can be debated. It's conjectural, but they did exist. And we saw that one example earlier. And on the right, the full house. Now here's again on the left, a 1915 view of the, let's say the Pierce Haskell Caliph House here, because it's still got the elm trees, it's still on its original site, it still has all of the later additions from the mid-19th century, and the twin big chimneys up there that disappeared at the time of the move. Then we get to the period of the turn of the century when the Moose Lodge took it over, and you see it lifted up, pushed back, and a great stone retaining wall put in with a grand staircase, and the moose, I wish I had seen the mooses, and the porches added. But those details were additive. They didn't really destroy it. On the interior, of course, some of the trim remained because some of it remained until it was demolished recently, and you'll see that in a while. But here's my conjectural restoration of the house if it had been a half house in the Federal period with its 3 stories and the doorway at the left and the Jacob and the Asher Benjamin doorway. That's the way it could have been restored. You see the retaining wall still there, and this is a conjectural possibility of what might have been. And on the right, another possibility is, just make it Moose Hall period. And then here's the Haskell period, late or mid-19th century restoration. That's another possibility where, most of these houses do not have their original cladding on the exterior, no matter when they were built. They've been restored or replaced. But that was another possibility with the frame still intact. The exterior could have gone back to that period with the chimneys and the elms and all of the period pieces. But there, of course, today, or as it was recently, it was an eyesore. But it was part of the context of the street. And here, the City Hall, and this is the view down toward the water. Another view up the street with all the different periods of architecture. There's not one consistent period or style right here, except this corner had 3 or 4 Federal period houses on it, and it was a kind of a old corner in Gloucester. like the old corner in Boston. And here we have the evolution of the house belonging to the Art Association. You can see they've replaced the windows. It's not all original either. That's a great 1920s photo. So they've done some restoration there too. So even the buildings that we think of as pristine have all very often been restored, or at least parts of them. Then finally we have the context again, the Art Association and the Greek Revival building there. And then we have the poor old Moose Hall on the corner, and the possibilities were kind of endless. It was then that Steve and people came to its attempted rescue, just like the John Hancock House. And the demolition of the John Hancock House in Boston, of course, started the preservation movement in 1863. That's why Old South was preserved later. But this is perhaps the result of too much demolition and not enough creative thinking. You've got the parking lot on the opposite corner, and there's the Moose Hall, and there's some of the uncomfortable additions. We'll look at the house in detail. You can see that the columns of the porch were all pretty much turn of the century. It had been filled in with this ugly infill that could have been removed. The stucco wasn't great, but could have been replaced or altered. But here we have the interior. Some of these 18th century doors remained, and the house, which could have been built in the 1780s by David Pierce, you see these 18th century details and the heavy, heavy timber framing in there. So the possibilities were there, and I understand the frame was solid. There you have an 18th century surround up in the attic, very similar to the one in the house opposite. You see a second one. You see the little border of the wallpaper left there, probably from the period of the Haskells. And then another 18th century door that even has the H&L hinges. So there was stuff that could have been salvaged in there as well, which I fortunately never had a chance to say. There's the detail of the H&L hinge. That's probably before 1800 in all likelihood. And then on the right, you see the mid-19th century stairway, which was perfectly acceptable as a mid-19th century Victorian stairway, in pretty good shape, actually. And the doorway itself the trim was all there. It just needed a little bit of the infill change. So there were possibilities here that never got explored. So here we are, and we're trying to fight off the inevitable, but I wanted to point out here that Joan of Arc, the reason that you know this is in Gloucester and not somewhere else in this photo is look at the building in the background. That's a hipped-roof federal period house, and I'd say looks a lot like Gloucester. Now, what do you think? Where could this other one be? So that shows you the importance of context. And that's in Paris, of course, but the context tells you what about this place. And so here we are. This is one of my possibilities on the left. You know, if people didn't like the mooses, they could have them removed. On the right, I thought maybe some dolphin sculptures would be nice. And then, unfortunately, this is the end result. But we have that view opened up of the building behind it. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you go around demolishing buildings. And then we have at least a little pocket park, and we have some pocket parking along with it. But it's not unique to Gloucester, and I want people not to feel too guilty and too hopeless, because it's happened in our own local historical town of Georgetown, where I come from. No less than 5 houses, and actually I believe 6 have been demolished within the last 2 or 3 years. And this is just the lament for those. And this is one close-up of the demise of one of the more picturesque ones. It turns out it was quite substandard on the inside. But nevertheless, it was a great piece of architecture for the period. And then finally, the worst loss of the local region, and it's not unique to Gloucester, is in Newbury, and the Tappan House at 1 Little's Lane. This happens to be at the entrance to the Spencer Pierce Little Farm, which some of you may know. And it was a tragic loss. So it's part of a bigger situation, and I hope everybody will appreciate the possibilities that were lost, as well as some of the history, of which I didn't give you a whole lot, but I refer you again to Prudence Fish's book for the details. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. And I'll take questions if anybody has some. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I might have rushed a little much. I hope not. Okay.
Are you kidding that nothing from the interior was saved?
That's my understanding, but only the people who tore it down know. I wasn't here. I think it was demolished.
I mean, did they do
So
this in the
quickly.
dark of night?
Just about, because I was having it, they got the permission, I think, late in one day. And the next day, about noontime, I was having lunch with somebody in a restaurant, and a friend of mine knew I was there and came racing in to tell me that it was down, gone, that fast, by noontime.
There's what's left. It doesn't look like they were very
Yeah,
careful.
no,
about
they
it.
sent, the only thing we managed to preserve, I have to tell you, is there was some timbers that fell onto the sidewalk. And and they looked like the place in Norway. They were in perfect condition. So I salvaged some of the wood, hoping that someday that we'd maybe be able to, when people had more of a conscience and realized what we lost, we could make a model or a sculpture that spoke. But the timber was in perfect condition. So I was tempted to go on to the site to save more after, later, but I didn't want to get arrested. It wasn't worth that. But that's, unfortunately, you see, I think what happened, what was going on was this whole myth had been built up. They were trying to say this was a worthless place. Mm-hmm. So if so they just sent in the thing and really destroyed it in a few minutes.
But wasn't the Historic Commission involved? I mean, didn't they say you can't tear it down, but?
No, they approved it. I was there and spoke against it, and the entire commission voted
But
in
they
favor.
couldn't stipulate you can tear it down, but we need to go in first and salvage.
Yeah, there are
they
contingencies
said-
they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They mumbled something about, well, maybe we could save some doors or something, but, Rick, I don't know if they can see what you have there, the left-hand view of the demolition, and I don't know if you can read what's underneath it.
Oh, yeah.
I
But it
didn't
says Cape
necessarily
Ann
want you to.
Museum, Art, History, Culture.
Right.
Well, that was on one of their flyers, and I just took it literally from the
Yeah,
flyer.
yeah.
That's their slogan,
Oh, yeah.
Art, History, Culture.
Right.
Here it is.
Got it.
Yeah, yeah. Incidentally, at the start of my talk, I'd like, I talked about the wonderful work that Rick, he put so much work into this, and on our flyer, we put it online, his full report that talks about it. And I think it's important because this demolition is going on all over, and I don't want this house to have died in vain. We need to educate people and make them aware. And that has been done previously, as Rick spoke to, by Prue's wonderful book.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been aware and would not have made an effort to preserve this house if I hadn't read Prue's book, because like most people in town, I just saw this rundown, what everybody would call it as an eyesore, with people who had drunk too much, were drinking too much, hanging out there. And then, when I read Prue's book, I said, wow, I mean, this is, this is a gem. This, we really need to save this.
It's not always just all about the architecture, the parade of people that lived in that house, from David Purse, who was he was the wealthiest man in Gloucester until he lost a lot of vessels and then had to retreat to his from his mansion to this house.
Right, and they were in the China trade
The
as
China
merchants.
trade.
They had
Right,
incredible
right.
collections in the house, apparently.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
are
Right.
still somewhere. I don't know where.
All of Captain Haskell's papers are at Mystic Seaport,
Mhm.
and
But there were collections of furnishings as well that he brought back
most
from
of them
the
were
Orient.
sold at auction. I think some was taken by the family, but there was a big auction.
Mhm.
They called it one of the finest properties in town at that time. But then there was the caliph's son who graduated from West Point and fired the first shots at Gettysburg. The husband of one of them that lived there was the second mayor of the city of Gloucester. It goes on and on and on and on. But one other
I'm sorry, who was the third family who I've never heard of before?
caliph, and these were different generations. He was one of the first dry goods dealers, and he had a store on Main Street. But he had married Captain Haskell's daughter. So
So it was really part of the same family.
it was all
so
the same family until
Yeah.
it went to the company that renovated for the Moose. Another point that I was going to make is that many of the Federals, the three-story hip roof houses that you see in Gloucester, except for the museum and the one next door and this house, which I think was always 3 stories, most of them are older. They were gambrel roofs.
and they gained a story.
Jacob Smith, I think, was very busy running around building the hip roof third floors to update them. There
And we
aren't
know
too-
he did the library, right? Am I right?
Oh yeah,
And,
yeah.
that was really elaborate. I wish I had a drawing of it when it was
There's
first done.
no picture of it, but that was done by Captain Beach, and Jacob Smith did the work. And the description of it is in Reverend Bentley's diary. He went there to visit it and described it. But most of the 3-story houses with the hip roofs did start out as gambrel roofed houses, 1760, 70, 50, and then were updated. That's why you see some of them with center chimneys, and you would not normally see a center chimney on a Federal period hip roof house.
They did evolve, and that's some of what I was trying to show, was that nothing very much stays the same. And I meant to make 2 other quick points. One is that the Shirley Eustace House, if you've been to see the Governor Shirley Eustace House in Roxbury, if you want to talk about hopeless, that took 70 years to restore. But it was known as the Shirley Useless House. And now you go down there and see it. It's got programs for schools in town. It's got all kinds of orchards growing around it. They're doing urban agriculture there, and it's amazing what you can do.
And if you can get a tour with Rick,
Mm.
it'll make your day.
Well,
I'd like to know how you got into this, say, after college or...
well, what happened was I was born into it because my grandfather was an architect who went to Columbia in the first graduating class there in 1885. And then my father was an architect, and I followed him around as a little toddler around his restorations in New Jersey. And then we moved up to the Cape, and I was in Boston at,
And where in New Jersey?
it was a place called Scotch Plains.
Scotch Plains, I know that.
And actually, I came up here in my college years and was working at Faneuil Hall Market. So that was my college summer job on the restoration with Tad Stahl and Roger Webb at Architectural Heritage before Ben Thompson got into it.
Oh, that's...
So then that's how I evolved and went to Columbia in preservation. So,
Have you ever been to Salem, New Jersey, by the way?
well, I know about it. It's great.